Good morning or good afternoon to everybody who's joined us for the webinar for the fourth session of the Digital Data Flows Emerging Technologies series. We're so happy to have you all. I see that people are going to be joining as we speak to the live streamed version of this event. Also, big welcome to our group of participants in the room today. Really happy to have you here. We have a really exciting session and lots of time for question and answers today on an extremely important topic for regulators and policymakers around the world, which is Adtech. And I'm going to bring up some information here today about the series, if we could get the slides up. As most of you know, but some of you may be new to, the Digital Data Flows Masterclass series is a year-long series of educational programs hosted by us here at the Future of Privacy Forum in Washington, D.C., and co-hosted with the University of Free Brussels Privacy Hub. And we have hosted 3 of the 8 sessions so far in the fall. You may have joined us in Brussels, or you may have joined us on one of the live streams, and we've covered topics from de-identification to location data to artificial intelligence and machine learning. And in the future, we will be covering another set of diverse topics, everything from mobile devices, IoT, sensors, smart homes, smart cities, biometrics, and facial recognition in particular. This will be throughout the year and on into fall 2019. The full schedule, which continues to be updated, is available at our website, fpf.org/classes. And we are really excited to be hosting these events. Today, I'm very pleased to say we're going to be covering advertising technologies. As you know, if you are familiar with the Digital Data Flows Masterclass series, we do not cover law, we do not cover policy. The goal of FPF and Brussels Privacy Hub with this event is to bring information to you about how the stuff works. How does the technology work? How do the data flows happen? What are the business models that are being regulated? With the goal of anyone who's involved in policy, anyone involved in law, of having a better understanding of the systems that are being regulated. And then it is up to the policymakers and the smart lawyers of the world to find out ways to meaningfully regulate these practices. So we're going to have a 2-hour session today. With lots of time built in for Q&A. I'm very excited about our guest speakers. In the first section, in the first hour, just to level set for our folks on the live stream, we're going to spend about 40 minutes with our first guest speaker today, talking through a little bit of the history, a little bit of the basic concepts for understanding Adtech, and some more understanding about business models, because the big picture concepts, the economic concepts, are incredibly important to understanding the incentives, what's driving advertisers and publishers to make the decisions they're making. We're going to get a little bit into the tech there and a little bit into the Adtech jargon. If you were ever confused about the difference between a DSP and an SSP, you're going to learn that today. Very exciting. And we'll leave some time for Q&A there at the end before we move on to our next guest speaker, who will speak in much more granular detail to do a deep dive with you about real-time bidding. This is a very hot topic. What we're referring to here is the ability of websites to load an advertisement within 120 milliseconds when a website loads, to choose which advertisement to deliver, and to auction and manage that sale process in the back end in a complex way that our guest, Rob Van Eijk, will explain. That gets a little bit into how do we measure privacy within this system, and very excited to have Rob present some of his research today that he's been conducting at Leiden University. After that, and after we've reserved some time at the end for questions for Rob, we've got 20 minutes at the end reserved for open Q&A. So for our guests in the room, you can raise your hand. For our guests on the live stream, we will be doing chat Q&A, and I will be keeping an eye on it over here as the moderator for this session. So when you have questions, jump in, we'll address them. If you have questions during the presentations, jump in. Don't know what that thing meant, I will interrupt the speakers and get your question answered for you. The only thing that we're not covering today is detailed questions on legal application. We're not going to be talking about the GDPR or anything else. We're going to be talking about the technology and how it works. So with that said, very excited to have you all here. I see we have participants on the live stream too. And we will go ahead and, without further ado, get started with our first speaker. Adam.
Thank you. I think I'm okay with this.
Oh, right.
Great. Thank you, everybody. My name is Adam Towvim. I'm an adjunct professor at Brandeis University's Business School and also a partner with Chameleon Collective. I'm going to talk about the history, the business models, really the basic concepts of Adtech. And I think it's going to be a good history lesson for us and also an understanding of what motivates the different players within the ecosystem. Oh, I need my, there we go. So advertising has been around for a very long time. Adtech came about because of a lot of emerging technologies, beginning essentially in the 90s and growing up through today. So as I mentioned, ad-funded content, ad-funded publications have been around since the early days of all forms of published media. And we think of advertising today as primarily being driven by very large corporations across multi-million-dollar TV budgets, but the reality is there's a lot of advertising out there that funds very small publishers, and it could be very small advertisers who have decided that they've created one compelling product and they want to reach an audience, make the audience aware of it, get the audience interested in the product and buy it. And so this ad tech ecosystem serves all those players, some differently than others. One thing we should keep in mind, though, is even though advertising has been around for a long time, and we're all familiar with reading a magazine or a newspaper, a physically printed medium, and seeing ads there, if you look at this red line about what has happened with internet advertising, these are the ads we see when we go to a website, the ads we see inside of mobile apps, or when we visit a mobile website, or sitting on a tablet, or even playing ad-funded video games. That global ad spending has eclipsed everything else, even TV spending. Part of it is where we spend our time interacting with this media. The internet has been a big part of that. Digital content has been a big part of that shift. And as we're going to talk about with the evolution of ad tech, the technology, the tools to make all of that happen, to allow an advertiser to connect with their audience on publishers' property, that ecosystem has grown up as well and helped accelerate the dramatic increase in that spending. So we're all familiar with, or a lot of us are probably familiar with, the famous quotation of half the money I spend on advertising is wasted. The trouble is I don't know which half. And it is often a reference to large amounts of advertising being allocated in a block of spending, typically on TV is historically where it took place. There's a big campaign across the entire country, and an audience is made aware of a particular product. At some point thereafter, as the advertiser, you measure an uptick in the purchases of your product. But which half of the advertising drove that? Was it the creative? Was it the targeting? What's actually making it happen? And so we're going to come back to how effectively that is measured today, and Rob's going to do a great job of uncovering the specifics of that at a more detailed level. But I want us to think about what motivates an advertiser. Listen, they have ads, they have a banner ad, a video ad, and they want to connect with their audience and have their audience see that ad. It's to increase brand awareness and make sure they're reaching the right demographics, either existing users or to acquire new customers. But ultimately, their economic motivation is to maximize reach and to maximize what the industry calls ROAS, return on advertising spend. Put another way, if I invest $1 million into an advertising campaign, does that result in an increase of an additional $2 million in product sales, or is it $5 million in product sales? It matters a lot, and oftentimes you can have dramatic increases in ROAS based on the right type of targeting, metrics, and capabilities that you make use of within the ad tech ecosystem. Now, even though we think of these economic motivations of an advertiser as wanting to reach as many people as possible and do it cost effectively by maximizing ROAS, advertisers also recognize that they have brand equity. And independent of a lot of the privacy concerns that we as practitioners are always mindful of, an advertiser does want to make sure that their brand equity is preserved properly and make sure the brand isn't eroded and shown on the wrong properties. So advertisers, even if they are maximizing reach and ROAS, they still care a lot about preserving that brand equity. They care a lot about where that ad shows up and the ad engagement experience. Publishers have the people that the advertisers are trying to reach, and they naturally want to fund the cost of publishing their mobile web app, their website, or any other digital property. And every time a new screen shows up in an app, every time a new page is loaded in a website, the publisher has the opportunity, it's at their discretion, to select an ad from the Adtech ecosystem to place there. That is a form of supply. They're supplying that to the Adtech ecosystem. We're going to come back to that term supply. And the advertisers are the ones that provide the demand. Now, if you think about that form of supply, if every time I'm going out and requesting an ad, there's a certain amount of latency that's going to occur before I show my website page, there's a risk that it could be the wrong ad. So I really want to maximize that yield. I want to make sure as many of those ad slots, those ad spots, are filled, and I want to maximize the ad rate. If there are 1,000 spots being filled, I'd prefer those 1,000 spots generate $1 or $2 in revenue as opposed to 10 cents or 20 cents in revenue. And the differences can be that dramatic. I'm also trying to minimize the user experience disruption. I want to make sure that I'm not showing too many ads to users in a given session, in a given day, and I want to make sure that that publishing experience is retained. So this started way back in 1994, but it's really evolved a long way since, and we're going to trace that evolution. Before we do, just want people to understand the basics, the mechanics of how these ads get requested. Rob's going to go into some great detail after me about how the real-time bidding aspect of this works. But some of the basics of websites requesting an ad in a few steps. We've got a user typing in a URL, they hit enter, and the browser that sits on our laptop or sits on our mobile phone, that is referred to as the client-side part of this ecosystem. That is going to first establish a connection to the website's servers. Next, it's going to send a request in a specific format. It's the HTTP format. It's a particular protocol. And it's going to include information about the browser and the operating system data. And it may include something called cookies that belong to the domain. We're going to talk about cookies in a minute. This is a spoiler alert. They're not the kind you eat. The website returns instructions that goes back to the browser. So the server side, the website server, returns the information to the browser, and then the browser interprets that and makes decisions about how to display it, how to present it. And it's a secure, it is more and more, almost exclusively these days, it is a secure connection. Most websites will also integrate third-party content. And we're going to cover that in a minute, what we mean by third-party content. But it could be additional fonts, images, ads, other analytic reporting, and even plugins and videos.
Adam, while we pause on this slide for just a moment for the viewers, can you tell us briefly, why is the browser and operating system data sent in the HTTP request? That's a lot of information being sent just to send the request. Why is that?
So it's very important when the server side, the web server is returning data, that it knows what can be displayed. Inherently, there will be limitations of an operating system of what can be done. It's also very helpful to know, is this a Chrome browser or Safari browser or Firefox browser running on a mobile operating system or running on a desktop operating system? I may elect to send down certain pieces of dynamic content for a laptop's browser, but not for a mobile web browser. I also may elect to make some formatting decisions along the way. So first and third party. The first party content, think of that information as the information that the publisher, it's typically the information that the publisher has developed. It's the text of the article. It may be photos that the publication has or other pieces of media that the publication has that goes along with the article or along with other pieces of content. But I will also, as a website owner, as a digital property owner, I will elect to bring in third-party information. Think about my motivation. Think about my mission. My mission is to produce highly relevant, engaging content for my publishing audience. I can't also hire a lot of people who have expertise on reporting, analytics, a lot of the sophisticated fonts that need to be developed. Inevitably, I want to be able to rely on third parties, on additional partners to publish along with me. And so sometimes I can receive that on the publishing website's server beforehand, before the web page is requested. But other times I may elect at runtime. I may elect at the time that the content is being delivered down to the browser or down to a particular device's app. I may elect at that time to have some code in the delivery that calls out to a third party, that calls out and asks for that third party content. And yes, a lot of times that third party content will be ads to the tune of tens, if not hundreds of billions of times per day. So we mentioned a cookie. This is a cookie that can be set, and cookies came about for a solution for state management. What state is my user in? Have I ever seen them before? Have they ever signed up? Have they logged in? Do I trust them because there is a cookie that has been set and I know that they are already logged in, and therefore I can bring up some of their history. I can provide more relevant information for them. Before cookies, they came about in the mid-90s, before cookies, a lot of the content just looked the same. You could be a very loyal reader, subscriber, purchaser of content or products, and I still wouldn't know anything about you. So cookies help to solve that. It ends up being a very small text file. That's what a cookie is. And it is set inside the browser. And the browser is set up to accept and store this cookie. And cookies came about initially purely as first-party cookies. Cookies that were created and set by the company that was publishing the content. So here's an example of the first visit to our website. There is no cookie, and the request is sent to the server. A homepage of a website is sent back, and an instruction to save a cookie. It could be a number. It could be a long string of both characters and digits. There's a lot of flexibility that the cookie writer has in determining what that is. And then on the second visit, the browser can send that cookie information. And now the server side, the website server, either first or third party, knows information about the individual browser and sometimes even the individual who's using that browser because they've logged in. It's important to note that a cookie can just be as simple as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But if the server has a lot of information about that individual cookie, that opens up a wealth of opportunity for personalization, a wealth of opportunity for, hopefully, responsible use of the data that's stored on the server side. We also want to cover the concept of a web pixel, sometimes affectionately called a bug, but it is simply an invisible one-by-one pixel. It is where the content that is being delivered down to the website will also contain information to request a pixel. And it may be a pixel, it's a one-by-one invisible pixel, the user never sees it, but because the web browser is going through the process of saying, well, I need to put this pixel out there, and the pixel has its own URL, it will go back out, and it could be to a third party, to say, I'm requesting this invisible pixel. It is a convenient vehicle to request information or send information back to a first or third party server. And a great example of that is a particular website. In this case, we're using the New York Times website as an example. They may want to place a pixel to be able to note which pages a user is going to view. The retailer may want to place a pixel on a, hey, thank you for purchasing our product page. And that's usually a very important page in the e-commerce world. It's not enough to know they put something in the cart and they hit that page. Not enough to know they even are ready to order or even hit the checkout button. You want to know that after the checkout button was hit and a purchase payment server sent back a successful purchase notification, that the browser was able to then, and only then, successfully display the thank you for purchasing page. And that's when that invisible pixel can be fired. And often it will be fired off to a reporting analytics server somewhere that is doing some tracking. And if advertisers are working with publishers and they want an independent third party that's trusted, that can do the verification that the ad was delivered, a lot of times that's what is happening is third parties are monitoring the successful completion of a particular action inside the individual's browser. So we're now going to talk about programmatic and how this has risen up. In the mid-90s, as we talked about the beginning of digital advertising, it was a very manual process. A lot of that has become more automated, and it is a very, very big industry unto itself. It is a substantial part of the digital advertising ecosystem, and we will talk about how it evolved, but this is important to note that these campaigns can be set up now in a matter of minutes, whereas in the early days of digital advertising, it took days, if not weeks. So what do we mean by programmatic? The first term we mean there is that it is contextual. Because we are operating at high-speed automation, we have the luxury of tailoring information or ad-funded content to a website or category of websites in real time. And so for an agency that is setting up a campaign for an airline advertiser, they will look for travel-related websites. And they will typically, in real time, automatically scour the landscape to find those contextually relevant websites. It also allows for retargeting. You'll hear this used a lot in programmatic. So if an individual has visited a particular website, and I, as an advertiser, have a choice of spending $100,000 to acquire new users who have never visited the website, they may know nothing about the website, or I could try and bring individuals back, the opportunity to retarget them in real time and find them on another property. This is another term you'll hear used in programmatic. I may also have information about their behavioral patterns, their online browsing behavior. If I know that they are browsing digital sports properties, if I know that they are consuming content related to certain types of outdoor sports, can I make a strong enough inference that that individual would naturally be interested in products that are related to a pickup truck, related to male gender-focused advertisements? There's a lot of inferences that people can make from behavioral history and create audience segments there. And programmatic has a lot of the same digital advertising pricing models that we've seen grow up in digital advertising. It could be cost per click. I will pay as an advertiser anytime a user clicks on the ad. And if you think about that, that creates a lot of risk on the part of the publishing properties, right? They have a finite amount of times they can show ads. They don't want to show a lot of ads that nobody's clicking on. So everybody in the industry monitors, sometimes to a fault, monitors the click-through rate there. The cost per impression is another way to pay for advertisements within the programmatic ecosystem. A CPM, or cost per impression, is really typically focused on brand awareness, or it is certainly focused on the economic motivation to show as many of those ads as possible. And then there's a form of measurement, usually independently, A/B testing afterwards by people who've been exposed to that impression and those who have not, of measuring, well, was there any incremental benefit in terms of awareness or likelihood to purchase a product. And then finally, a cost per action. This is really what allows programmatic to fulfill a lot of value for the advertiser to say, look, I don't just want to pay every time my ad is shown, every time an impression of my ad is created. I don't just want to show every time they click, because maybe the ad was kind of interesting and somebody just clicked on it because they thought it was funny. I want to show, I want to pay for that ad after they've seen it, clicked on it, and reached a certain state where we, the advertiser and publisher, have agreed, or we, the demand side and the supply side respectively, have agreed that that action warrants payment. It may be hitting a particular number of pages inside of the landing site's web pages, or it may be signing up for a newsletter, or it may be purchasing a product, is typically the case, or downloading an app. So we're going to trace the history a bit here, starting back in the mid-90s. In the mid-90s, if you were an advertiser and you wanted your ad shown on a website, you had to go directly to the website. You had phone calls. Tragically, you probably faxed things back and forth to make sure there were signatures recorded there. And you were also going to be sending information back and forth about the targeting information, what the demographics are. You would package up and probably have to email or courier over some of the banner ads that were created to show up there. But it was a very direct relationship, but also, we can all admit, a pretty inefficient relationship. But it was direct, and when everybody was visiting the Yahoo portal in the mid-90s, there was an efficiency because everything is aggregated. Let's fast forward to today. A lot of our interaction, a lot of our engagement with digital media is now much more fractured. Think of all the apps you have running on your mobile device as a great example. So not a very sustainable model, but it served its purposes for back then. So the evolution, and this was one of the first digital ads ever shown, so you can say that you witnessed history at the beginning. The evolution really evolved quickly from there, because advertisers started saying, wait, there are now too many websites popping up. This is incredibly inefficient. I have to have separate contracts with all of these publishers, with all of these websites. That's not sustainable. The websites start getting headaches because you can only employ so many people to bring in all of these insertion orders, all of these requests to run ad campaigns, and how do you manage it all? And so what came about in the 90s and into about the year 2000 was the notion of an ad network, who was aggregating up the websites and then creating a much more efficient relationship with the advertiser. And so on both sides, it was a little better, but still there was a lot of faxing of information. There was a lot of sending spreadsheets with the actual media plan and all the pacing throughout a given month. It was still very inefficient. And if you started $1 million campaign, you had to load everything up and take a few weeks to get to there, and then get some reporting along the way, and you would constantly bothering the ad network for that reporting. I know, I work for one of them, and it's quite an ordeal. So even that is not efficient.
And Adam, from your experience working for an ad network, and let's leave this slide up while I ask this question so that people see the relationship. Why did this create privacy concerns? I mean, the benefit of the ad network is, one, to represent different publishers in an efficient way, but also brings the benefit of being able to see information across different publishers.
So it's seen information across different publishers as persistent identifiers started to rise, especially in the mobile world, that I could see those identifiers across multiple properties. I can track behavior at much larger scale. And also a challenge we always faced is we're an intermediary. We don't have that direct relationship with the individual data subject, with the individual user. And so constantly having to push a lot of reps and warrants and legal obligations down to all of those publishers. Good question. So the efficiency started to come about in the mid-2000s with the rise of ad exchanges. Ad exchanges automated this whole process. On the supply side, websites could have one party, ideally, that they interacted with, and then that request, rather than having to be daisy-chained, sometimes across multiple ad networks before the rise of ad exchanges, it could go to one supply-side platform, it could go into the ad exchange, and there could be a real-time auction where multiple parties representing the advertisers, multiple parties representing the demand side, could all, within sometimes just tens of milliseconds, conduct an auction. The winner would then send their ad down through the supply-side platform onto the website.
And just to briefly level set for folks, when you say demand side and supply side on this diagram,
so on this side, we're seeing the demand side being represented by the advertiser, and as we mentioned before, the publisher of the website is supplying the inventory into the exchanges. And so the SSP here came about to create those efficiencies and allow a representation on the supply side for the automation and on the demand side. And so what you have today is an ad tech value chain that really allows the advertiser to set up that campaign and have bidding done for them by the demand side platform, the DSP, and they are in real time, within milliseconds, communicating with an SSP that is then able to send that information down to the app, to the publisher, so an individual user can see that information. But there's a lot of challenges in that the cookie is crumbling. The cookie, it can only identify an individual inside of a single browser, desktop browser, mobile web browser, but that's separate. Those two are separate from each other, and then also separate from information about the individual inside of a particular app. A lot more browsing is on mobile, and that activity inside of apps is not supported by cookies typically. And so now we're all accessing data. That engagement with media is fractured across multiple experiences, multiple platforms. Mobile apps, as I mentioned, do not support cookies, but they do have their own unique device identifiers. Those device identifiers can be reset, but there's also sensor data that comes along with the apps, and as you can see, that don't allow continue. It's very limited real estate. We can say in a mapping application we're going to use your location information, and you can infer that it's really about tracking you in real time, but who else is that location information being shared with? You usually have to go into a privacy policy that's elsewhere inside the app, or sometimes also on the website itself. There's plenty of mobile platform controls. The mobile platforms themselves do allow you to turn off the ad tracking. That's another way of saying, I may have a device identifier, stop sending it to any advertisers. You also can say, I understand that you're sending these identifiers to advertisers, but now please reset it, just the way you could delete your cookies, and those would be reset for ad tracking purposes. You can also reset your device identifier. There's also a lot of location data that gets sent along with these ad requests. And if it's done properly, it's always done with the user's permission within the current data privacy regimes. But this is important to note that a lot of that geographic data, if it's stored over time, creates a lot of opportunity, but a lot of issues along the way, especially we as practitioners know that. There's a lot of great work that's been done on cross-device tracking. The Future Privacy Forum has done it here in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission, and really understanding some of the issues that arise with cross-device tracking. The industry does use it because it is important if I am running an experience on a desktop website, and then I also have a mobile app. If the user is logged in on both of those, in a logged in state on both of those digital properties, I have a tremendous advantage of being able to track them cross-device. As we mentioned, ad networks exchanges, the intermediaries, also can make use of this information, and it creates a whole host of issues there. The way that cross-device matching occurs is in a number of different ways, one of which is deterministic. It's a very explicit link. As I mentioned, the login identifier of a publisher's unique user ID on the desktop and inside of a mobile app, that can be a deterministic linkage. But there can also be a deterministic linkage between a cryptographic hash, an obfuscation, a transformation of a user's email, but it does stay persistent. Even if it's in a cryptographic format that can never or almost never be reversed, it is still a persistent identifier. And as practitioners, we should be conscious of that. But it is a deterministic match. There's also ways of doing it on a probabilistic basis. This is probably the same user. And if I can get a lot of information about the devices, the same IP address, the same usage of time of day, these devices accessing on a home network, or if I can see thousands of devices during the evening, I know it's at a coffee shop, and it's not just the 5 devices that I happen to see that might be at a home. The probabilistic is an alternative to cookies. There's a type of probabilistic identification that's typically done on the server side when all that attribute information comes back about the language that the user has set to their device, the plugins, the platform, the time zone they're in, the screen resolution. You start to get, in this case, to a chance of, 1 in 280,000 that there will be a collision of a particular user. And if you're at enough scale, and advertising is a medium of scale, it's a method of scale, this is a mechanism to track individuals. It also degrades over time because people can change some of that information. So what's on the horizon? What should we be aware of within the Adtech ecosystem? There's a lot that's changing more and more on the web and inside of mobile platforms. There's a lot more learning, real-time machine learning and artificial intelligence that's enabling new types of capabilities and also new issues for us to be aware of. The platforms themselves are evolving with their app permissions and making it more and more usable and more part of the user experience, especially as we as individuals begin to demand more of that. And the ecosystem becomes more familiar with how to standardize. It's not always for a lack of caring. There's a lot of standardization needed there. And then, of course, new technologies create all new kinds of issues, especially when we think about the limited screen real estate to provide notice, to allow for changes in consent, to allow for multiple players, as we mentioned the intermediaries before, in the ecosystem who would allow for changes in consent and be able to communicate that across the ecosystem. Questions? So
we've got a question in the room, and folks on the live stream, feel free to join in as well, and I'll see your questions right here. Yes.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the ads delivering from a customer's, from a publisher's point of view. Something like you used your New York Times example. I know when I'm on online and I'm trying to read articles, sometimes it'll say you've used 1 of 3 or 1 of 4. And then I also wanted you to talk a little bit about ad fraud, because I know that is a problem for the industry, and how it's important to understand who people are for those purposes.
So just to make sure, do we know if the folks on the webinar could hear the question? Just in case, I'm going to repeat it into the mic. The question was about first-party publishers, for example, the New York Times. What are some of the ways that they keep track of how many times I've seen an article? Everybody's had the experience of, going to their favorite publisher, Washington Post, whatever, and it says you've only got 2 out of 4 free articles left. Used to be a little bit easier to get around. How do they do that today? And then the second question was if you could speak a little bit to ad fraud, maybe what generates that, what the incentives are, and how big a deal is that within the ad tech industry?
So publishers have an incentive to publish this content and make sure they're able to continue to do it. If you're the New York Times, you need a lot of investigative reporters out there. And you can obviously have ad-funded content. You can also have people come from time to time, and you want them to see a few articles, but if they're using a certain number of too many articles, you really want them to sign up as some form of a subscriber. And so what you will typically do, what the industry has evolved to, is saying, I as a publisher, I'm going to track, and in using some tracking mechanism, I'm going to track how many articles in a given time period, usually a month, you've used, and you can track it via cookies. Sometimes people open up a private browser and then they try and get around it. You can also track it using some of this fingerprinting capabilities as well. But ultimately, that's what you're trying to do there, is you're trying to use some of that inherent, it's the same tracking mechanisms that we're using in the Adtech ecosystem, and they're just using it to make sure that they're tracking and setting up the appropriate gates for their own content.
And just for those of us who want to get into the really nitty-gritty, when you're tracking number of page views, number of articles viewed within a first-party relationship, are you assuming that most of the major players are using cookies for this? Does it have to be a persistent identifier string in the cookie, or can we use numbers, and this ends up being relevant to folks who are determining whether this counts as PII?
Well, you have to persist something, right? Because over a 30-day period, I need to know that it's the same individual coming back, or it's the same browser, at least, coming back. Obviously, if you have multiple browsers running and they're using cookies, the different browsers you have running on your desktop will each look like an different user, unless, and this is where some of the benefits of fingerprinting come in, right? I do want to know that maybe someone's coming because it's the same individual, or it's at least the same computer coming. But to answer your question, I will use some persistent identifier. The advantage is, if it's over a 30-day period, I will reset that pretty aggressively. Was there the second question?
Ad fraud.
Oh, it was ad fraud. Ad fraud is a big problem. If I am an exchange, even if I'm a supply-side platform, I am receiving, as I mentioned, tens of billions, it could even be hundreds of billions of ad requests a day from all over the world. It is very hard for me to verify. It's one thing to verify that it's the New York Times, right? I typically have some type of managed relationship, human-to-human contact there. But if I have a self-serve part where an individual website that's just a mobile app starting up in some part of the world, and they want to just be able to create an ad-funded revenue stream, I create a self-service portal for them. The app developer slots in the code, and they're off and running. How do I know that that's an individual app developer versus some automated bots that have been set up to mimic the requests of legitimate publishers, of legitimate apps? And so ad fraud is a big problem. This is not a 0.5% of advertising dollars is ad fraud. This is, this is tens of percentage points type of problem, and the industry is working very hard to bring that down. It's not 80% of all ad spend is deemed fraudulent, but it is substantial, and it's something that, alongside a lot of the privacy concerns, solving that ad fraud problem has a lot of benefits because you are authenticating at least the publisher, and if not, the user. And as long as you're doing it in a responsible way, doing that form of authentication helps to rid the world of ad fraud. But it is a big, big problem.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you. We got a couple more minutes before we turn to our next speaker. One participant would like us to deep dive a little bit more into real-time bidding, how that auctioning process works. We've reserved the full second hour for you, so no worries. We're going to reserve that one, I think, for Rob. It's a great question. And another participant wants to know, who are these ad exchanges, I think is the gist of the question. Who are the ad exchanges? Who are we actually talking about? And are they drawing personal data about individuals from other sources besides interactions with users on websites? Or
So-
with the first-party website, and then I would say with other websites. What are some of the other sources?
So the ad exchanges, one of the most well-known ones, AppNexus, now part of AT&T. They're a great example. They rose and amassed a lot of both supply and demand. Responsible actors, responsible ad exchanges go to great lengths to have no PII, or at least what we historically thought of PII. no emails, no individual information about people. They will store, ad exchanges will store hashed emails so that they can make decisions about those.
And just to clarify, because Adam, you have a long history of being an industry expert within this field, a lot of history within Adtech. You say we didn't historically think of it as PII, so clarify, what do you mean?
So historically, the industry wanted to go to great lengths to not have Adam Towvim's email coming inside their four walls, or phone number, or name and address, my first and last name and my street address. The industry evolved to using hashed emails. It's a cryptographic hash. It's not encrypted, so in theory, it can never be reversed, especially at high levels of cryptographic protection. But it is a persistent identifier. It is something that is done, and it is one mechanism, so the input of Adam Towvim's email will always produce the same output. Just can't reverse it, but there's still that persistent identifier, and separate apps, separate SSPs and DSPs may all be using the same hashing algorithm. They will all arrive at that same hashed or transformed identifier. And that's where I think a lot of us as practitioners start to raise concerns, because it's persistent, and as the data privacy regimes now see those persistent identifiers as PII, that's why I was referencing that.
Excellent. I think that's a really good overview, the persistent IDs and cookies and hashed emails. And I think the cryptographic hash can be a little hard to understand for people that are brand new to that. Like you said, it's a one-way transformation. That in
a one-way
theory,
function.
A one-way function, that it gets you to a random string.
Yep, and if I change the first letter of my name, the one-way function will produce a dramatically different output. It's not as though one character in that 20-character representation of my email address.
Not like key coding. Yeah, of course. But the major benefit is if I have your hashed email and then another company over here has your hashed email, we can link them and know that the same email exists in both databases.
And early on, the industry referred to that as a match key, because it became a key for adding data. And your question about are the ad exchanges bringing in data, they're typically bringing in data from data management platforms or directly from data brokers. And those data brokers may have amassed data from your loyalty card data in your grocery store. So there's a lot of inferences they draw about shopping habits, but they also may have your email address there. And if they're using the same one-way function there in an offline environment, that is how you onboard. That is how you bring offline data into the Adtech ecosystem. Again, a lot of the industry players do go to great lengths, the responsible players go to great lengths to make sure that there's nothing that is unhashed, there's nothing that's naked about that data coming through, even if it's just, buys green consumer products, buys healthy products. They want all that information to be stripped of anything that could be deemed as what we historically thought of PII.
Okay, awesome. Oh, we have one more from the participants. How easily can a cryptographically hashed phone number, first of all, you should talk about phone numbers. Those are increasingly being used in addition to email addresses as an identifier for offline data. How easily can a cryptographically hashed phone number be brute forced back to the original phone number?
That's a great question. Must be a closet mathematician there. The advantage of phone numbers is there's a finite universe of them in the United States. You're talking about 10 digits. So if I take my one-way function and I do it for all permutations of a 10-digit phone number, and I create what the industry calls a rainbow table, all the colors, but it's a collectively exhaustive universe that I can quickly assemble. And if I have the processing power, and I have to know the hashing algorithm, SHA-1, SHA-2, SHA-256, MD5, then if I know that algorithm, then I can run it through that matching, and I could back into that. It does require a lot of processing power, and all I have to do as an individual player in this ecosystem is interject, instead of that publicly available function that everybody uses is the same, just the way you'd add salt to a soup recipe, you salt the hash. And it's a little private key that transforms the function, the hashing algorithm. And so the output then is not something you could ever reliably back into. But now, when I go to the offline data broker, they have to have that salted hash formula as well. So it's a way of preventing getting around that rainbow table, or at least creating extra hops. But that is probably one of the easiest ways to get around some of it. But you have to have a collectively exhaustive universe. Email addresses are not as great for that because
I think we've got time for one more short question, I think.
I know we said we weren't going to apply any law, so I'm not going to do that. But
And full disclosure, I'm not a lawyer, so.
But my question is, say you did have a data breach, and say we decide in whatever jurisdiction that ad ID and these kind of identifiers are personal information. How would the person who lost the data then let people know about it? Is there a way at that point?
So this is a relevant question. If there's a data breach and it's a breach of just ad IDs, for example, how would people know? How would they contact you? I think it's a broader question, too, because this is coming up in the context of access requests. Mm-hmm. If you don't have and this is a legal question, so we'll set aside the legality, the legal requirements, just at a technical level. If you've got an ad ID associated with my mobile device, but you don't have my name or contact information, can I submit an access request? Is that even possible? What are the issues there?
So this is a challenge. I can tell you in the early days of mobile, the device identifier, there was no ability to reset it, and we wanted to be responsible and say to individuals, hey, if you want us to remove you, we are happy to do that. You have to send us your device ID. And we had instructions on how you could do it, but somebody has to know how to get it. More and more those capabilities or the education is out there, but you would have to at least be able to send in some type of identifying information. This is one of the challenges of where we need to get to with a lot more standards so that an individual, an intermediary in this ad tech value chain, that's one of the things that as practitioners is really challenging is there's so many intermediaries. Every one of those intermediaries should ultimately have a standard mechanism to be able to say to an individual that during a subject access request, here's the information to supply to us, and here's what we promise we will, what actions we promise we will take.
I think that's a great place to leave it on a sort of a practical practitioner comment. We are going to bring Adam back at the end of the session, so if you think you have more questions for Adam on the business models or the practice of being in ad tech, we will still have time for that at the end. Thanks so much, Adam.
All right.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.
And I want to introduce our next speaker as we bring up his information. Dr. Robbert van Eijk. Rob is an academic researcher at Leiden University in the Netherlands, and we're very excited to have him here. He recently completed his PhD with a publication on WPM of RTB, Web Privacy Management of Real-Time Bidding. And so he's a deep academic expert on real-time bidding and on this concept that you're going to talk about a little bit today, Rob, of how you measure privacy in the context of real-time bidding. So take it away.
Oh, thank you. And also the audience here, if you have any questions, please feel free to bring them up. What I'll do is I'll recap a little bit of what Adam has been talking about, but also put them in a different perspective, which is very much focused on RTB and the question, how does real-time bidding work? So we'll run through 5 topics. First, sketch a little bit of a theoretical overview, the 9 steps in which the different parties, and we touched upon the supply-side platform and the demand-side platform, but how do they interact with each other? I'll go to a little bit more detail on that. Then I'll touch upon some of the things I've seen in my research, the empirical model, and recent technological developments in real-time bidding are also very interesting to highlight, which we'll do at the 4th topic. And we'll recap some of this in the conclusions in the end. So the theoretical model is basically that you probably have experienced as well. You've clicked on a specific website. So we basically see real-time bidding as a technology rapidly being deployed, not just in the US, but also throughout Europe and in other economic markets. So the professional term, or actually definition for real-time bidding, would be an RTB system. It's a network of partners who compete with each other in offering advertisements within the marketing area of the organization. And this fits well into the concept of the ad exchange that Adam introduced. What we see now is that the concept of programmatic and real-time bidding includes not just the ad exchange, but also the supply-side platform, the demand-side platform, but also the data management platforms, which, as Adam rightfully pointed out, are able to add offline and online data to persistent identifiers. So the system, the RTB system, aims to improve sales through real-time data-driven marketing and personalized behavioral ads. And we've seen retargeting as well as one of the possible techniques that you can get through real-time bidding. So it's not just about the cookie anymore nowadays. The cookie, of course, is in existence through a request for comments, which is in 1995. We briefly touched upon fingerprinting, and there we can differentiate between server-side fingerprinting, but also fingerprinting within the browser. So we would typically define these as active fingerprinting and passive fingerprinting. And I'll show you a little bit later on in one of the slides where this fingerprinting actually happens, because it's very close to the ad that you will see on the website that you're loading. The tracking pixels, and the interesting thing is here that the concept of the pixel was like a really physical pixel on your screen, but nowadays it's also possible to set the attributes of that pixel to 0, which makes it completely invisible as well for the human eye. And to give you an idea of what such a pixel looks like, is if you've bought a new flat screen, one of the first things you should do is when you take it out of the cover, is to see whether there are any pixels in there that are not working anymore. So you can get like a new screen back for your warranty. This is the size of the 1x1 pixel. But just keep in mind the 0x0 is very common to see contributed to the ads. The URL identifier, this is a mechanism that allows a website, for instance the example of the New York Times, if we elaborate on that, to add in the www.newyorktimes.com with question marks and equation signs identifiers, which could be the deterministic or probabilistic identifiers we briefly touched upon before. So I'm loading a web page, and in a typical browser, and just to make things very simple, the ad on the bottom right is not just a static picture anymore. It's surrounded by technology like iframes, but also SafeFrame. An iframe is typically a door towards third parties that allows them to download code to the browser, which the browser then will display in a way that the ad becomes measurable, like the click-through rates, but also the conversion tracking that you may want to add. The SafeFrame is a very specific solution from Google as a response to the ad fraud which we've seen, but also to the malware and ransomware risks that we see connected to ads, which is you don't want to visit a very legitimate website like the New York Times and being exposed to ads that may introduce ransomware or malware to your computer. But this is actually a very realistic risk that's connected to the programmatic and real-time bidding ecosystem. So solutions like SafeFrame have been developed and introduced over the years. So what you see is a gateway to the display networks or to the ad networks, or to the collection of partners that in the end make that ad happen in 0.01 seconds. So in my research I looked at these various parties, and what I'll do is I'll quickly run through a little bit more detail on the specifics of these parties. So I'll run through each of these various elements within the real-time bidding system with the aim of then looking at the real-time bidding process itself, which is a 9-step process. And I have an animation which basically summarizes the steps a little bit further on in the presentation. Let's first start briefly by looking at the publisher, and for you to note that the summary will be on the bottom right corner all the time, so it's very easy to go back in tracking where we are in the story. So the publisher wants to sell the ad space to media buyers and advertisers, and the real-time bidding system, of course, aims to provide sales through these real-time data marketing and personalized behavioral advertisements. This is the aim, of course. We want to make money, and this is what Adam really set out before. The inventory sources, the interesting takeaway there is that it's not just about the browser screen anymore. The number of screens are actually very diverse. You'll see laptops, mobile phones, but also tablets, smart watches. What we also will see in the near future is the billboards out in the public space. But another good example is with something they're experimenting in Japan already for a number of years, is personalized price tags in the supermarket. So the takeaway of this list is that if you have a screen, you have an opportunity to communicate with a prospect or a potential customer, and you can offer them a personalized marketing message. And the inventory sources, of course, are then the space where the real-time bidding system connects to in order to display the ad. I run a quick analysis to see what are at the moment top very popular types of advertisements. And one of these is the medium rectangle. And the medium rectangle is on the top of the page. And the leaderboard is like another very specific advertisement, which you'll see and will be traded in the real-time bidding ecosystem. The supply side platforms, they enable the publishers to auction the ad slots to all the media buyers and advertisers. That's basically their reason for existence. They specialize in matching the advertisers with the supply side publishers network. And an example is Improve Digital, which is a company based in the Netherlands. And if you look at the scale of the number of advertisers they can reach out to, but also the number of media buying partners, it will show a little bit of a scale of these ad networks, the network of partners which we are dealing with. Other examples are AppNexus, which Adam mentioned, also programmatic, and the Rubicon project. The demand-side platform enables its network partners to bid for the ad slots, which is the other side, which is where the advertisers are. And in order to make sure we have a valuable ad, there's a lot of metadata that can be added into the transaction. And typically there's geolocation, gender, browsing history, but also things like buying intent. And I'll show you an example of a real-time bidding request a little bit further on. Here again, these networks are pretty much vast. It includes a lot of different parties, and the demand-side platforms do not exist in isolation. But of course, there are a number of different demand-side platforms, and in the end, they connect all the different advertising parties.
Rob, if I could ask you a quick question.
Yes.
Looking at the names of all of these DSPs, how many of these have what we call self-serve mechanisms, in the sense, can I, as an individual, take $20 and go place ads at all of these DSPs?
Well, a number of these have a so-called user interface. If you have a business and you want to run an ad campaign, you can sign up to them, and they'll guide you into a selection process for the intended audience. You may focus your marketing campaign towards, and then you can run your ad.
Facebook is a good example of this, right? Making it very easy for individuals to place advertisements. And others, if I understand correctly, are more bespoke. Maybe you have to have a very expensive partnership in order to place ads through an agency. Is that right?
Yes, actually I did not put this in here, but there are different real-time bidding protocols, which allows you to interact with real-time bidding partners. And some of these protocols require, of course, that you implement them correctly, and they are of a proprietary nature. But there are also open protocols, like the Internet Advertising Bureau. They have a protocol called OpenRTB, an open bidder, which is open for all companies to implement if they want to. But what we see now as well, that there are, of course, companies specializing in implementing this technology. So you will not have to implement them yourselves, but you can use their technology.
And just to clarify, not all of these DSPs use a real-time bidding protocol, right? Either OpenRTB or their own proprietary RTB. Or are they all using some kind of protocol? Because others, like some of the social media networks, are closed systems.
Yeah, but you do need a protocol. I mean, it's about bringing together demand and supply. So you need a bid request and you need bid responses. And at that transaction, you already define a protocol. And of course, there are different types of protocols. So the data management platform is like a third important partner in this ecosystem. It enables the DSPs and the SSPs to zoom into the audience and specialize, of course, in customer data. And for an SSP having access to customer data means that it puts them in a better position to personalize the content on their websites offered to the end user. But for a DSP to have access to the customer data, it means that it puts them in a better position to follow them around the internet. Okay, so quickly what I just described, we have the proprietary and the open protocols. And this is typically what an open example of an open protocol looks like. And what you see here is on the 6th line, it's a little bit older version of the open RTB protocol. And everything on the right are attributes to the user. And here we talk about what type of segment were they categorized in. It is like the online news. So if a user is typically visiting an online news page, it may fall into this category. Location is a second attribute that you will see. Age is also a typical attribute included in the bid request, but also things like buying intent. And because the cookie, like we've seen before, is just a very limited storage mechanism to convey identifiers, you see that this structure, which is a very much more rich way of passing on information about the user, and this is why the real-time bidding protocols are much more advanced than the cookie protocols from the 90s. A recent development are private deals. Private deals where you have actually, where we go back in time, we learned from the historical perspective from Adam that you would have to have personalized contracts between an advertiser and a publisher. It's beneficial for some of the advertisers to go back to that situation again, and this is why private deals are gaining at the moment. And for instance, a brand may have an interest in buying inventory for a special price on a website it believes its customers are present. This may be a driver to sign up a private contract. The tag-based integration sees to the slide which you've seen before with the iframes and the safe frame image. This is actually, you need some code, you need a secret sauce around the ad to make sure that ad becomes intelligent. That you enable the ad to communicate, to reach out to the third parties. So the tag-based integration offers a technology that makes it easier for a marketeer to manage this complex technology from a central place, a central user interface, and to run things that are important for measuring the campaign, for driving the campaign. And this is actually a very important element, and the web code that's used to download in the browser is called JavaScript. Then the 9 steps of RTB. First, of course, a user needs to go to a website in the browser, type in the URL, and then the ad server starts picking a publisher on an SSP. The SSP selects an RTB exchange, and then of course, the bidding starts, which means that the bid request is sent out to hundreds of RTB network partners and enables them to bid for ads to be served on the publisher's ad slot, which is the little space on the website that can be filled with an ad. In the 5th, you see that there's a need to make sure that the fact that an ad was shown to a user needs to be retained. It's an important element for a marketing campaign to have this knowledge. And this is where the cookie syncing happens in the 5th step of the real-time bidding process. So a specific user will not be known to just one party, one partner within the ad network. This knowledge will be shared between all the parties And the technology to do this is through the cookie syncing. Then the RTB exchange determines the winning bid. And of course then a process starts in a few steps to load that ad from a content distribution network, which is an efficient way to make sure that the latency, the time needed to load and display the ad, is as short as possible. And the verification scripts, which are the tag-based integration, which I talked about briefly before. So how does this look like in an animation? First, the first step is you load the website, then the SSP is being selected, the ad exchange is being selected, then the bid request is sent to a lot of different parties. There's a winning bid being communicated back. The cookie syncing happens. Then the process to serve the winning bid is started. The BSP server agency sends the creative, which is the smart ad. And the ad itself is being loaded in the top in the bottom right corner of the web page, in this case. And the verification scripts are loaded as well.
Should we pause here for a moment?
Yes.
I think this is a lot of content on one slide, and I know people will need just a second to digest it. Questions in the room as we pause here? I think we've covered what everything stands for: DMP, SSP, DSP. You might need to explain CDN.
A CDN is a content distribution network, which is a way to store the ad itself, the image, on different locations throughout the world, to make sure that you do not have to load this. For instance, if all the servers are in Seattle, then if I would, for instance, load this ad from the Netherlands, it would have to go a long way in order to be shown on the web page. So there's a system out there to balance that in an efficient way all over the world, to make sure that the ad is not just transacted, but also shown on the ad page as quick as possible, so the total experience of visiting a page and the ad being shown is minimized as much as possible. And therefore you need the content distribution networks, which is a technical network of partners that specialize in serving the ad on different servers in different local geographical regions.
All right, and to put it into the context of some of the basic concepts that we learned in the first hour, starting right here at the steps 1 and 2 phase, what we're really dealing with is usually a cookie ID, right? But that form of identification changes once you get into the ad exchange layer, into something else. So what's being communicated in the actual bids? You had a slide on this with different IDs.
Yes, that's metadata. So everything. It can be a very rich set of metadata about the user, not just a rough location where the user is at the moment for hyper-local marketing, but also maybe an age range or information about the browsing history. So if you looked for websites to buy sneakers, that might somehow reveal maybe a possible buying intent. It's not a causal relation, but it's more a probabilistic approach to attaching a buying intent identifier to the metadata about the user in that bid request. So the bid request is a collection of different types of attributes that describe the intended audience, but also describe the visitor which is present at that moment on this very specific website. So the challenge is to bring together the audiences that are being defined by the marketeers with the intended websites where the audience may be present at. And this is where the metadata comes in, which is communicated through the bid requests and the bid responses.
Metadata like what kind of website it is, the URL of the website.
Screen size.
But
also age, location, buying intent. Yes.
And we have one question. When RTB, when real-time bidding is used, how long does it take to upload an ad on a website? So basically what the question is, Rob, is this whole slide start to finish?
Yes.
How much time does this take?
Well, in 2012, it took about 0.03 seconds, but this has increased quite dramatically. So I think, and maybe I look to Adam as well, that the 0.01 is very much feasible at the moment.
0.01?
Yeah, I mean, if you start to get into the hundreds of milliseconds, multiple hundreds, that's where users really start to notice the latency, and that's where a lot of different players get really concerned because they're all trying to keep things, each hop is trying to be as efficient as possible. And if you're upwards of a second, especially on mobile, it's just unsustainable. And so typically what will happen is these automated intermediaries will shut you off because you're taking too long in between each hop.
Makes sense to me. Hopefully this helps answer the question. We've also got, can you get into the specifics about how the success of the ad is measured in the verification step? I agree with that one. Success of an advertisement can be measured in a lot of ways, and we talked about it a little bit about that in the first hour. It could be whether you clicked on it, but nobody clicks on ads anymore, right? So more likely they're interested in whether you took some kind of action. How do they measure success?
Yeah, or whether you've seen an ad, because like viewability is an important thing.
True.
If you have a long website, and it's not, well, you've not scrolled on the screen yet. Why should you pay for that ad if the user has not seen it? So you want to be able to measure that.
This makes sense, and I would think some advertisers, Coca-Cola, they're really not trying to do something specific. They're trying to increase brand awareness. Just get their logo out as much as possible. So different advertisers have different motivations and are looking at success in different ways. Which entity is it that is doing that measurement? Is that happening at the ad exchange or with the DMP? Or
it depends. I mean, if you're a big brand, you may have that technology available to yourself. But I also have, like in the recent developments, that cloud-based is like the next move. So all the technology is available also for the non-technological advertiser and marketeer.
Yeah, and I think even, as this is being, I think this is working okay. As it's being served down here, we talked in the first half about these pixels that could be fired for ad measurement and success that the user reached a certain destination or landing page, and you can measure some effectiveness there. And if ultimately you're buying an ad campaign is running and you're trying to get a direct response from the user to sign up for something or to buy a product, then you'd really correlate it back to, did they actually ultimately buy the product? And to Rob's point, you may just be running impressions and you want to know, did people actually view it? If they've had exposure to the ad media, then you can run some surveys after the fact. You can gather up, there's benefit to having these IDs because you can gather up all the IDs that saw the media. You can ask them, hey, are you aware of this particular product or this particular company? And then you can ask the unexposed group. You can suppress the people who saw the ad media. You can ask them the same question and you can compare the difference. And if the campaign was effective, even if nobody was clicking on it, you would then be able to say that campaign was a success as long as it met some minimum threshold of uplift.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. I think that's really helpful clarity there. And it's also, I'll point out, exactly where some of the major privacy concerns come into play, right? Because we have started collecting data from many different sources, including offline, and I think a lot of people get concerned with tracking of online and whether you made a purchase in a retail store, for example. We had one in the room.
Just wanted to ask about the security of the bid. Like, I know there are a lot of people in this ecosystem, but can third parties see these data streams?
So is all this data being sent encrypted?
Well, it's sent encrypted, but of course you can interact with a server that has been hacked, and then encryption doesn't really matter because a malware ad or an ad which contains malware code can still run through the whole value chain. This is one of the problems that we have in the ecosystem, and it can run a lot of problems, of course. And Adam.
Rob, this is a great diagram because it talks about all the individual players, especially in the third-party advertising ecosystem. Could you maybe, for the audience, it occurs to me, the rise of Amazon, Facebook, I mean, Google's been around for a while anyhow, but a lot of them are referred sometimes to as, and others are referred to as walled gardens. Could you comment on how a more contained ecosystem, like a social media platform, straddles some of these different components? Because in a sense, there may be different privacy considerations there because one entity is overseeing multiple parts of these steps.
In my research, I classify the different real-time bidding groups, the three groups, which is the Facebook, Google, and the more open real-time bidding systems. Of course, Facebook is a very specific ecosystem where in order to able to use the Facebook bidding platform, the standards are very high. Also, the costs are very high. And you have to be able to demonstrate an implementation within a very short amount of time, and you only get one chance. So that means the quality of the technology companies that are able to participate in the Facebook ad exchange is very high. Then we have the Google ad display network, which is all about the DSPs. There's a list of, I think it's over 1,200 companies now that signed up with Google to be able to participate in this ad exchange, in this partner of networks. And then we have the systems which we would call the long tail, which is the internet advertising and bureau system, for instance, based on the open RTB ad. And there, of course, it's a different protocol, and as long as you have a contract, for instance, with AppNexus to contribute to them and to be able to send a bid request there, you're in the game. You can actually start bidding. I hope I answered this question briefly.
I think so, and we're getting a bunch more in the queue, really good questions. I'm thinking maybe I want to leave a couple of them to the end where we're going to bring Adam back too and let you guys sort of tackle a couple of these together. The questions that we're getting are around where does profiling happen? Where are decisions being made around what kinds of attributes to associate to a particular user ID? And another question is, where are the spots within this system for privacy controls? Where are the opt-ins happening? Where are the opt-outs happening? Where is the ad blocking happening? Where does all of that take place? And I think maybe let's leave those two to the end. The one that I do think would be useful to answer is, we have one question about measurement. So we talked about cost per action, measuring advertising effectiveness based on some future activity, making a purchase, visiting a retail store. All of that's after the fact, right? Because this is happening within 120 so milliseconds.
Yes.
That's all after the fact, just to clarify. Yes. And who's doing that measuring generally?
Well, here you see at the last step, the verification JavaScript. Mm-hmm. This is where the code needed to see how the ad is performing is being loaded. And whichever third party that script is communicating with is within the script itself. It could be one partner, it could be multiple partners. Mm-hmm. But that's more an element. It means this is one specific implementation that's connected to the ad itself. And of course it makes sense to add that technology close to the ad, because things like viewability or other characteristics of the ad really have to do a lot with the device or the browser type that you're showing the web page on. And for instance, the size of the screen is then important, but also the page length. And that's all done within the browser or within the app.
Awesome, thank you. And we've also got one on header bidding, but I think you're going to get there in just a minute. So, yeah. Okay. Thanks, folks.
Let's see what the time is doing. I very quickly run through the academic results and then go to the header bidding stuff. So I took up the challenge to make the privacy measurable. And of course, when you start measuring, the point of measurement really determines what type of black box that you're dealing with. And in this real-time bidding process, I took the challenge to start collecting the data which is being communicated between your browser and the third parties that you are communicating with. Of course, there are a number of third parties that you do not have a direct relationship with, for instance, data management platforms. And this then creates a black box that as a scientist you have to deal with. And in order to make sense of that black box, I try to map the interaction between the networks, between the partners, and how they are cooperating within the ecosystem. And I took a special context, which is European media news websites, and I took the approach to like a visual approach. And I call it a graph-based methodological approach. And the interesting thing is that I looked at it from a legal perspective and used data science tools to visualize. So what am I talking about? Is if you are on a specific website and on the left side you see URL -1, URI and URI +1. These are the websites that I'm visiting in the sequence in time. And if I hit a pixel in the middle, it will send out a request to a third party, and this is called label A here. But that pixel may redirect to another third party. And this type of behavior is very common in real-time bidding data flows. So if you start collecting and visualizing this data, you can store this in a graph database. And the blue circle in the middle represents all the websites that have been visited. So I collated them all on top of each other to make a little bit more sense of what's happening. And what you see here on the right is a group which you can then isolate. And this, of course, is a very simplistic example to make sense of, okay, I actually make connections to a number of third parties, but how do these relate to each other? If we look at the situation in Denmark in 2016, where I visited all the national and regional news websites, you get a graph like this, and then you see a very big group on the left. And if we zoom into that, it's clear that that represents the Rubicon network, which is a real-time bidding partner network that, like AppNexus, is very active in an open type of real-time bidding. If I go one back, the yellow here on the top represents the DoubleClick network. Then, if you look at the size of the graph, it becomes interesting because the aspect of measuring privacy now relates to how are the laws in the very specific countries being implemented, being transposed. And we're not going to go into the legal details here, but what I leave here is that due to the European level or the European norm for cookies and the mechanism to implement it in national law, a directive was used. That means there's a little bit of room between how cookie laws will apply in the various countries. And what we see here is that the measurement type approach shows that in countries like the Netherlands and Norway on the left, in comparison to Romania, Germany, UK, but also Spain, for instance, have a different regime towards how are companies adhering to the cookie laws in these very specific countries. So we know that from history that in the UK, for instance, they had an implied consent model, whereas in the Netherlands they had a very much more strict consent model. So this is one of the results of the thesis. So looking at the network science perspective to the problem is new. The essence lies in being able to distinguish the different networks to which the partners belong who are involved in an RTB system. And the new way of investigating also shows the role of the various partners in an advertising network. They all use the same technology, and it was not very clear on one of these sites, but sometimes these networks are connected to each other. So occasionally you can tap into another network. So you're able to, for instance, AppNexus really specializes also in connecting different networks to each other. And that's something that surfaces from this type of looking. Third, relates to the differences in consent implementations. I'm going to skip this slide because it really goes a little bit more into the legal aspects. And now the interesting part about developments in browsers. Of course, we've touched upon fingerprinting, and the browser has been a proxy for the user. And what we've seen is that browsers are more and more incorporating mechanisms to help the user in making choices on whether they want to be tracked or not. And one of the recent developments is, of course, you can delete your cookies, you can clear state, and the shift control delete is a shortcut that you can use to clear the state of the browser. And of course, within that 1 month period of measuring your marketing campaign, you will not be measured anymore. And you can also, and this is for instance Firefox, but also Apple have started to implement technologies to differentiate between what's now a cookie that's used for tracking and what's not used for tracking. And of course there's like a whitelist approach, but you also see more and more algorithmic approaches at the moment. And this is like a first step into giving the user a little bit more tools and options to choice whether they want to be tracked or not, or whether they want to be exposed to behavioral advertising or not. And in Firefox, for example, the fact that you're not just blocking third parties, you can also now say we want to have specific cookies that we want to, because we know that these may be used for tracking, that we can block. So at the moment, the browser detects that a tracking cookie may leave the browser and start to communicate with the third party. This configuration option then helps the user to block that communication. Deal IDs, which is a very recent development, enables publishers to monetize ad slots directly with media buyers and advertisers through private deals. This is an important one because the Deal ID basically empowers the publisher and not so much the ad network. And this is all about the shift of who's in control of the advertising money flow. The other one relates to Deal ID is the header bidding, which enables publishers to reach out to an ad exchange immediately after an end user request, or so when you load the web page, to ask for bids, and this applies usually to a specific ad, which is then on the top, the leaderboard of the web page.
Actually, Rob, I think that's a really important point about the shifting control to the publisher. Both the Deal ID, where they can say, hey, based on a very manual managed relationship with an advertiser, I'm going to send these bids out into the programmatic landscape, but only certain advertisers that I have relationships with know to deal with that, know to look for that Deal ID. And header bidding, if I'm a publisher and I used to go out to one SSP, one supply side platform, and then I had to wait for them to come back with an auction, and maybe I chose a second source out there. Instead now, I can, at the header level, I can do this bid and ultimately have more control over a parallel auction. I could have Facebook, and then one SSP that controls everything else. But all of that sort of gives me a lot more control as a publisher on the supply side.
Bidding as a service is something that's not been mentioned in many presentations, but this is like a cloud-based option to make real-time bidding technology accessible for non-technological marketeers or non-technological companies. It also solves the problem of being able to communicate with systems that depend on very specific open art of real-time bidding protocols. So if you sign up for a bidding as a service platform, you don't have to worry anymore about OpenRTB, OpenBidder, the Google bidding platforms, but also like Facebook. They will take that role, and it makes it much more easier to respond to a marketing campaign and to be able to also shorten the amount of time needed to implement real-time bidding technology. Because you only have to implement the APIs, which is a set of instructions which you can, basically it's a library which you communicate with, and it's a standardized way to simplify the complexity which is behind. And one of the major things it solves, like I just said, is the ability to communicate with very different real-time bidding protocols. Two examples, BWAX, which runs on the Amazon platform, and OpenBidder, which runs on the Google platform. Four conclusions, and then we can go to questions. I think you touched upon this already quickly, but everything that's got a screen, in theory, can be connected to the real-time bidding technology, which includes also online games. But we'll see email. That's like another thing that people may not expect. But it's not just limited to desktop and mobile web. The second thing is that the data flow, so the communication that happens between the browser and the third parties, can be measured and can be visualized because it contains structural metadata. And then you can create pictures, you can create graphs. It shows that the data flows are connected in a very specific way, and this has to do with the specializations of these third parties within a partner network, within that small ecosystem. For instance, a measurement third party will show up in a different way than the ad exchange itself, for instance, or the SSP or the DSP. So these are, in this graph, you see the more larger central nodes, and they typically reflect the ad auctions itself. Then the ability to compare the amount of tracking within countries between other countries is highly relevant in the EU, where we have the discussion on the e-privacy regulation, in which we try to level the differences between the cookie implementations by making it a regulation. That means the same rules apply to all the countries within the EU, which is not the case at the moment. And this leaves me to the questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rob. We've got a picture up here of the book-based version. Can people order that? Or
no, you can download it. It's for free.
You have to download it, print it. We have a copy here in the office, and this is up on SSRN as well. So let's reserve a couple of the first few minutes for questions specifically for Rob. And then we'll bring Adam back up here, too. We've got about 20 minutes left for all of the questions that we didn't get to a moment ago. So I'll invite our webinar attendees to chime in right here, and I'll see your questions up front. Why don't I start us off? If we could go back actually a few slides to what we were looking at here, the connections that are being made when you visit a website.
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, I should say I believe there are a number of other consumer-facing tools and browser tools that you can download plugins. I'm thinking of Lightbeam by Mozilla as a good example of one. If you want to see this in real time as you browse the internet, you can see the connections that are being made. These are not websites that people are visiting. These are third-party connections, correct?
Yeah, so the difference within approaches like Lightbeam, and there are like 10 others, is that here the website visited are centralized in one node, so that the focus is on the third parties itself, whereas in Lightbeam you will see also the websites you're visiting as separate nodes, and then the picture becomes very complex already after visiting 2 or 3 websites, and you will not be able to see the complexity if you visit, for instance, 1,000 websites. That's the difference in visualizing this approach.
This makes sense, and the distinction between first party and third party here is based on the domain in the cookie ID, or the ID being sent in the web traffic, right? So how do I know that what looks like a third party isn't being controlled by the first party I'm visiting, right? Because a lot of major publishers might be using services to do first party type things, and then in other contexts it might be purely third party. I mean, are these very clear distinctions?
They used to be very clear. I mean, the browsers were created with the same origin policy in the back of the mind. That means only a very specific third party could have access to its own cookies and would not have access to the first party context. But of course, with the introduction of JavaScript, there are now ways to circumvent this. And this is just about on the browser itself, but of course on the server, you can also start interacting between these contexts. So the very specific problem that was solved with the same origin policy is not addressing the risks attached to the differences in context and the privacy questions that are attached to that. Yes.
Okay. This makes sense. We have questions in the room. Okay. Yes.
I had a question about consent. If you just think about, you go to the New York Times site, at the time you're on that site, that's before all of this has happened. So without having to talk about legal things, in reality, what sort of notice or consent could you give, not knowing where it's going to go at that point, right?
Well, that's an important question. I mean, one of the elements that is attached to this network of partners is that it's open. So you don't know upfront which DSPs or which third parties will be involved. You also don't know which advertisement, which smart advertisement is called the creative, is being loaded. So even the advertisement can create privacy risks, which would mean that the consent required will be triggered. Because if that ad is smart enough that allows following across contexts through time, then even that needs, and the thing with notice and consent is that you need to inform before. So yeah, there's a difficulty. You see signs now within the industry to tackle this problem. I'll name 2 examples. The first one is Do Not Track, which offered the possibility at the moment that you are communicating with a third party to add metadata in the HTTP header. And the second, more recent one is the Transparency and Consent Framework of IAB, where they try to propagate the consent and the purpose that's connected to consent. So for whether it's just, for instance, a targeted advertising or a contextual advertisement, different purposes can be tied to the consent decision and passed along through the value chain. But of course, that does not solve the question or the problem we've talked about briefly before, which is access requests. Well, if this is considered PII and you want to have access to your data, to which parties do you go, and which identifier then do you use? And the interesting thing is that the Transparency and Consent framework of the IAB includes an audit ID, which of course is a very new way of trying to solve also different different problems related to consent. But of course, the real question whether consent is valid, that's still actively being debated because it's very hard to be specific. Yes.
Great question. More in the room before we, I think, bring Adam up for the last 15 minutes. I'm going to suggest, since we got the most questions on the very complicated ad ecosystem slide, developed credit really there has to go to Brave for development of that slide. I suggest we go back to that, so I'm going to bring this up and then maybe we can get it up here on the screen again once we get there.
Yeah, this is the one.
Oh, here we are. Whoop.
One back.
Okay, so we received the most questions on this slide, so I think it's worth pausing here for just a moment. And then one of the main questions, which I think you've answered a little bit just here with the discussion of Do Not Track and the IAB's consent framework, was where do the privacy controls exist? Like, where are the layers here? So, Adam, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind is, as we mentioned before, the Adtech value chain has a lot of intermediaries, unlike other industry sectors, really more so than just about any other subsector. And if you go to your grocery store and you sign up for the loyalty card, if everything's done properly, there is a notice there that the information may be shared with other individuals. If you go to a website and you sign up and provide your email address, there may be similar type of notice. But each of those islands of first-party data relationships with the subject are really disclosing the fact that it may be shared with third parties. But there are intermediaries in the middle. At no point did the user explicitly consent for some of these matchups to happen. We talked about this match key as a form of currency or a way to create liquidity in matching this data together. I think on the one hand, a lot of people would be very surprised at the degree to which that data is passed around, aggregated up, and lots of attributes added to that identifier. They may also not be aware the degree to which a lot of that is hashed or transformed and protected along the way. But it creates a lot of issues. And it seems to me what's happening a lot of times is that at every point that we have the first-party relationship with the user and also the user experience, right? I mean, that's a publisher really has that there is, a consent mechanism in place there with responsible parties, but there are inherent limitations because the ecosystem, a lot of times those individuals, as Rob mentioned, they don't know at the time that they're providing that notice and choice here in the United States. You don't know at the time what's going to happen. You can state to the user that that information may be shared with a third party and for what general purposes, but you don't always necessarily know what's going to happen and how it's going to be commingled with other data.
That makes total sense, and I'll echo Rob's point about the sort of growing role of operating systems and browsers in this too, to address some of those concerns. So for certain types of data, typically, at least speaking to the US context, you have to receive opt-in consent. So for instance, if the browser is going to collect and send geolocation, you are probably all familiar with this experience. Generally, you must be asked permission for the browser to collect geolocation. And then, of course, you get into a conversation about whether we really know how it's going to be used and all, but at least that is one layer, one mechanism where permission can be requested. We had one more question about profiling. So where in this, policymakers, regulators are very interested in where the decisions occur about what attributes to combine into a profile of a user. So if you look at one of the major DMPs, if you look at the marketing materials for Blue Kai on the internet, for example, you can see all of the different marketing segments like back-to-school shopper or new mother or running enthusiast. These marketing segments have to come from data sources. You can imagine much more sensitive marketing segments than the ones that I listed. So within this ecosystem, who typically is making those decisions about creating the marketing segments? Maybe this is one for our practitioner.
Yeah. So I think that's a good way to think about it. I mean, they are making the decisions about these segments. The IAB does have some advertising segments that are effectively just different areas. You talk about sports, entertainment, the types of consumer packaged goods. And so there's an attempt to have a standard taxonomy, but the reality is every data broker, the DMPs try to resolve that taxonomy across multiple data sources. But the data brokers themselves try to connect to that IAB segment, but a lot of times the data brokers have spent a lot of time with data modeling, data science, to come up with their own custom elements. And so they tend to deviate. But if you raise it up to a high enough level, if you are looking at a certain amount of scale for your ad campaign, you can typically resolve on some standard segments. But the reality is sometimes you're having to manage that across multiple data sources. The data management platforms you mentioned, Blue Kai, which is part of Oracle now, is one. Adobe is another. Crux, which is now a part of Salesforce. Salesforce's DMP is now what became of Crux, and those are some of the largest data management platforms. Also, Lotami. They all are trying to resolve that, especially if you are bringing in third-party data. It should also be noted that there is the rise of first-party data. There are a lot of platforms out there, the likes of Jebbit, that are gathering first-party data, and that is where the brand itself, the advertiser, is really taking ownership of that data and using it to fuel everything, even the emails they send out in their own first-party relationships with their consumers, but also to drive the targeting of specific segments or specific lists of ad campaigns, and they don't want anybody to know about what those proprietary segments are about. Maybe they push out some identifiers to run a campaign, but they'd rather nobody else know what that consists of for those particular segments. But it is important to note that all along, we really are talking about multi-site profiles. We're talking about a persistent profile. It persists somewhere, sometimes in the ad exchanges, and it can be used to target an individual across multiple properties. And for the data privacy regimes that are allowing a data subject to exercise the right to be forgotten, there's a lot of hops that happen here. I talked to one large platform that's been around for a very long time. It can take them anywhere from 2 weeks to 4 months to process one data subject request for a right to be forgotten, because they have that data across, even just inside their own four walls, they have it across multiple systems.
I wanted to ask a question about profiling, because I think the data is actually stored in different ways from a publisher standpoint. So a publisher is maybe in a new location for whatever reason. So a retailer is opening a new store in Washington, D.C., and they've had people in Maryland and Virginia previously. They go into their system and say, we'd like to target people who busy parents who want to pick up food on the way home, and they go into their system and they order, a parent segment, people who might be in this particular area segment, and then they push that out. It's not necessarily going to a profile in the way that you would think of it, like the person's name and address and account setting. It's just going out to give me all the cookies and ad IDs who have this particular attribute. And then in this split second, you're able to only target people there. Because people in California, people in Europe aren't going to care about a takeout service for food in DC. So is that almost a better way to think about the profiling? Because I think sometimes we assume that this stuff's a whole lot better than it actually is.
Yeah, I think the question was, if you're creating these segments that are classifications that could be applied to a lot of people, is that really profiling? And in a way, that's the way the early advertising grew up. It was just, find these classifications of people. I don't have profile identifiers to give you. But more and more, what is happening with social media platforms, with the exchanges, is people are finding that if they do upload their own lists, that is really where the profiling takes off.
To me, that's
but those
segments, data, and that's different.
That is. The segmenting you're talking about saying, hey, let's find people in the Metro DC area that would fit a certain set of classifications. Let's go out and just find those people based on certain criteria. Does not require a priori beforehand. It does not require us to have profiles or identifiers about people.
We've got one more question from the webinar participants, which I'm going to address to you, Rob. The question is, so this whole set of slides that we've been looking at, this is about advertisement delivery and the reporting on it. What about the actors in the ecosystem that are just interested in ID matching? Maybe they're not involved in the delivery of the ads at all. And maybe you came across this in some of your research, because I know cookie syncing is a major growing activity. What's the name for that? Are there actors in this ecosystem that are just doing ID matching? Maybe cross-device tracking is part of that. Where do they sit? How do we categorize that?
Yeah, there's a lot of cookie matching, cookie syncing going on, but you also see, for instance, a party like Crux had an API where you can send a very specific cookie towards and then get a response of all all other identifiers that would relate to the same user, but in different profiles.
I think actually one of the biggest players out there that tried to stay very neutral in this regard and just be about identity matching, or it's called identity resolution, because you're resolving identities across profiles across multiple devices to one person, is Axiom LiveRamp. They really LiveRamp grew up by talking to data brokers, DMPs, all in the media execution platforms, the exchanges, to say, look, we just want to be the connective tissue here. So having a LiveRamp ID is a form of currency that allows you to connect all of this. And they've gone to great lengths. They would say, Axiom LiveRamp would say, they've gone to great lengths to build privacy into all of this. There still exists, though, a heterogeneous ecosystem out there with lots of players there, and making sure that these cross-device identifiers, these resolved identities, are being used responsibly. As practitioners, it's something we need to keep in mind. It's so effectively resolving to identity. The term people-based marketing is used a lot, because ultimately you're trying to reach a person.
So we call that identity resolution, I guess, is the answer to the participant's question. Although I'll grant you it might be a bit of a misnomer, because when we think of identity, we're thinking of something maybe much more holistic than that. But identity resolution, I think, would be how we'd categorize it. And Rob mentioned it can be done through cookie syncing, through APIs, lots of technical methods here.
And by the way, for all the identity that's being resolved, for the most part, we're talking about things that are stripped of, name, email address, street address,
right.
phone number.
And in some cases, my understanding is it's really about being an intermediary in the sense that I can take someone's mobile ad identifiers over here and match them up with somebody's hashed emails or cookie identifiers over here. And because of me sitting as an intermediary, because of all the third-party and additional data sources I have, I might be able to make that link with some high or a certain degree of probability, right? Mm-hmm. And give it back without sharing the additional information that I used. So it brings up some, I think, really complicated questions about whether the data is sharing, whether it is sale, what's being disclosed, right? And that gets you into de-identification standards, and it raises a lot of really interesting legal questions, which we leave to the audience.
Well, I think a whole new level of not just de-identification, but pseudonymization, how the GDPR defined it, is really starting to take explicit declared identifiers and starting to interject some level of transformation noise rather than, at age 28 years old, but age band of 25 to 30. As long as it's not degrading the performance overall of my targeting and my measurement of return on ad spend, could we start to think about these micro segments being traded as currency rather than declarative, explicit record level identifiers, no matter how transformed they are.
Yeah, but there's still privacy risks attached to these pseudonymous identifiers. And there's one of the reasons why in the Article 4, in the definition of personal data, these identifiers are being included. And that doesn't mean that that type of profiling is not possible, but you just have to make it legal. So you need a legal ground, and this is where it becomes a little bit more difficult. And you see the difference in the legal regimes between the US and the EU. But it's very specifically as a response to deterministic and probabilistic identification, which relates to the legal questions of direct identification or indirect identification. The legislator has drawn up a very specific rule and made clear that this type of identifiers will fall within the regulatory framework.
Yes, absolutely. A lot of complexity there with regard to the legal application. Totally agree. This is PII that said I wouldn't make legal conclusions, but yes, yeah. Okay, I think that's all the questions from the webinar. Yes, and do we have any more questions in the room? We're at top of the hour. We're going to close things down. I just want to say thank you so much again to our guests today, Rob, Adam. Rob, we've got your contact information up here on the slide. Adam, I'm sure, would be happy to be contacted as well. The slides and the video of this presentation will be posted at fpf.org within the next few days, so we hope you'll use them, disseminate them, share them with whomever you want. We really hope it was helpful, and we at FPF are continuing to work on helpful resources of this nature to help people understand the advertising industry, some of the complexities that go into all these identifiers, some of the math behind all of it, the research behind all of it, and we'd welcome any help or feedback during that process. So thank you all so much for joining, and thanks so much to our webinar participants for joining the live stream. And we will see you at our next Masterclass session, which is scheduled for June 26th. And we'll hope you'll continue to follow along with us. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.